Hi, and welcome to Writing in the Sciences, a webinar hosted by the Athabasca University Write Site. Today we'll cover what to do before you start your writing task, understanding the paper in Writing in the Sciences, tips for types of writing in the sciences, and writing the paper, including introducing your paper, writing your methodology, writing your results, discussion or conclusion, and referencing. Before you start, in their article, Science Writing Made Simple, Turbeck et al. Explains something important about the writing process for scientific papers. Though it might seem as though writing comes at the end of the research process, after all the more interesting actions, they explain it should be attended to throughout the conducting of research or your study. They state, quote, "The scientific writing process can be a daunting and often procrastinated last step in the scientific process, leading to cursory attempts to get scientific arguments and results down on paper. However, scientific writing is not an afterthought and should begin well before drafting the first outline." Unquote. Turbeck et al. Suggest you do this by thinking of your research as a story, and the writing is telling that story. The setting of your story is the landscape of the existing literature, so part of the process will be researching where your work fits. You should also be mindful of understanding your audience's needs and write to your audience with the goal of them understanding and learning from your story. As you can see with the Turbeck et al. 2016 citation at the bottom of the screen, you can look for CSE style citations in the name year format at the bottom of each slide of this webinar. To prepare to craft a compelling story, determine what makes your story unique, or what sets your research apart, as Turbeck et al. Put it. To do this, seek to know the full context in which your own research is occurring. Depending on your level of study, some initial background reading can be useful. If you're a graduate student or upper year undergrad, usually you'll go straight to scholarly papers. If you like to get a different perspective first, you could read a recent book or two from reliable authors, or go to the popular works by well-established academics. This could lead you to other sources or give you a wider understanding of the history and meaning of your topic. However, if you're a first or second year undergraduate student, you may do some initial searching outside of academic sources to help you ensure you understand the topic. You could watch some YouTube videos or read encyclopedia entries. However, double-check your sources to ensure they're credible. If you're doing a lab report, Turbeck et al. Give a reminder to consult your textbook and lab manual to get the required background. Don't skim through this information. It will help you understand the experiment and why it's important, and it could give crucial information, as well as less obvious helpful hints about how to proceed. Garson identifies the most important texts to help you determine the background of your topic as academic history of the topic, foundational texts, and milestone studies. The setting of your story will be influenced by these landmarks, and sometimes they are actually called landmark studies. A literature review is the portion of your research that digs into more specific studies on your topic. These will be more narrow than the texts read during the background research. We'll talk more about this a bit later on, but in terms of crafting your story, this step could help you begin to flesh out more details for your narrative. As you're reading and taking notes, you may want to categorize your sources according to where they will be most useful in your paper. Finally, as you're learning the background to your topic, you'll also have the opportunity to pick up on important information about the writing itself. As Turbeck et al. Put it, quote, "This will provide critical insight into the structure and style that others have used when writing about the field and communicating ideas on this specific topic." Unquote. To have your work accepted in the field or subfield, it's important for your writing to be recognizable as belonging. As you read samples of writing in your field, you can also keep your brain attuned to what each does well, where it's lacking, and what it has in common with other samples. As you notice what they have in common, That can give you insight into the conventions of your field for each writing type. Because this webinar is about science disciplines in general, you may want to consult a guide that is for your specific field or your specific type of writing to learn conventions, especially at the graduate level. To help you in your research, you can review the AU Library's tutorials on evaluating your sources to ensure they are good quality. This link and other links throughout this webinar will be provided below the recording. The library's guide on evaluating your results helps you determine if your search results are appropriate for your particular project. Their guide on evaluating web information shows how to apply criteria to evaluate and fact-check online content. Finally, their peer review research guide shows how to find peer-reviewed articles or determine if a source is peer-reviewed. You can also watch our webinar on keeping organized as you search for tips specific to managing and organizing the research process. To prepare to tell a compelling story, ask yourself, what story do you want to tell and to whom? Different audiences include peer reviewers, conference attendees, professors, and classmates. Ask yourself if there are special considerations to make for these different audiences. For journal editors or peer reviewers, read other published articles in the journal to get a sense of what they're looking for. For conference attendees, consider what type of conference it is, general or specialized. For your instructor or professor, consider a marking guide and anything else you know about their expectations. For classmates, ask yourself whether they know as much as you do about the topic. What you want the audience to get from reading your paper is usually the main idea of your story. As you write, stay focused on your main point, what you want the audience to take away. This can bring cohesion to the paper and help your point to come across clearly. Here's an example of getting the main idea across clearly. This sentence ends Simard's introduction to her paper, Mycorrhizal Networks Facilitate Tree Communication, Learning, and Memory. She writes, "It is my hope that this might lead to an integrated approach to studying plant cognition in natural ecosystems that includes plant microbiomes." This demonstrates that Simard is aware of who her audience is and what she wants them to get from reading her paper. Who do you think her audience is? What does she want them to get from reading her paper? We'll discuss this example in more detail later. Now, as we go through different types of writing common in science, try to think about what the story you write might look like for each, what the research context might be, and who you might be writing to. The different types of science writing that we'll cover include question and answer assignments, lab reports, proposals, literature reviews, abstracts, journal articles, and presentations. In first-year courses especially, assignments may consist of answering questions about the textbook or course materials. The purpose is to help you process and understand the course materials, as well as then to demonstrate your understanding. Begin by checking the weight of the assignment and the weight of the question. For example, is the assignment worth 10% of the course? This can help you manage your expectations about the relative importance of the assignment so you don't stress too much if the weight is low, or so you can plan to put in extra time and energy if the weight is higher. You can apply this tip to any of your assignments. Next, consider how much each question is worth. If it is worth 3, 5, or 10 marks, this can give you an idea of how much detail to put into each question. If you're not sure about your instructor's expectations, ask them. Ask for an estimated number of sentences per question. If they say 10 sentences for a 5-mark question, this will give you a ballpark for how to approach a 10-mark question as well. If they ask for a paragraph, note that a paragraph is usually between 6 and 12 sentences. A short paragraph could be about 4 or 5 sentences. Clarify with your instructor if you need to. In many cases, you may be expected to refer to only one source, such as the textbook, when answering the question. In most cases, you will also be expected to cite that source. Cite the source at the beginning of the paragraph. Then try to make clear that you're still citing that source throughout the paragraph. For example, you could begin with, according to Simard, 2018, and then go on to Simard further describes. This will help you prevent citing at the end of every sentence, which can interrupt the flow of the writing. You can also use this tip when summarizing, such as when reporting the findings of an article in an annotated bibliography or literature review. For clarity and to ensure you've answered the question, turn the wording of a question into a statement to begin. For example, what is a microbiome becomes, according to Simard 2018, a microbiome is. Continue by providing sufficient detail based on what the source says about the question and what you know about the weight of the question and your instructor's expectations. Don't include irrelevant details that take the question off topic. This will be too much work for you when you have several questions to answer. Finally, avoid quoting and instead put the ideas in your own words. This is known as paraphrasing. To do so, do not write your answer while reading from the textbook. Put the textbook away, then write the idea as you understand it. This will demonstrate your understanding and ensure you do not plagiarize. After you write your paraphrase, you can double-check the textbook to make sure your details are accurate. End by double-checking the question to ensure you answered it completely. Note that it's not typical to quote in other types of scientific writing either, so sharpen your paraphrasing and summarizing skills. And you can sharpen your paraphrasing skills by watching our webinar on effective paraphrasing to learn the steps to effective paraphrasing and review what makes an ineffective paraphrase and borders on plagiarism. If this is something you find challenging, you can also book an appointment with a writing coach for strategies and practice. If lab work is part of your course, or if you are doing your own experimental work, keep a detailed journal, whether done by hand or digitally. Include theory you consulted, notes about setup, changes introduced during setup, equipment and their settings, data, calculations, and inferences, all in addition to results. Pairways and Anwar declare that, quote, the best notebook is the one that speaks for itself, unquote. Someone else, perhaps the future you, should be able to read it and understand all aspects of the experiment. Visual entries can be useful, including snapshots, sketches, and even cartoons. This journal will be the basis for writing an effective lab report. Many things you may use directly from your journal as you write. However, do not copy charts, procedures, or other things from the lab manual. If they are not cited properly, you could accidentally plagiarize. Plus, your audience, the instructor, doesn't need that information because they already have the lab manual. Background on the theory used may be needed, possibly as its own section after the introduction. When investigating a new phenomenon, extra background reading and thus explanation in the lab report could be needed. However, if you are repeating an experiment, the theoretical framework is likely already known and may not need to be repeated. A few comments of background information pertaining directly to the experiment could then be sufficient. Overall, studying the theory before you begin can help give you greater insight into the meaning of the experiment and give you context for discussing the results. When you get to the results, you will need to consider how best to present them to make them clear and to demonstrate their validity. Pairways and Anwar give the example of translating numerical data into table or graph form. Whatever will create the most organized and understandable presentation is the right medium to choose. Finally, Pairways and Anwar state that the discussion section, quote, should really be the most interesting part of the lab report, unquote. Yet they're aware that many students find it a slog. So what makes it so interesting? It requires scientific intuition and wisdom to interpret the results and draw out their significance. Now is your time to participate in the scientific conversation on the topic. Your interpretation comes from your unique scientist's mind. If you're stuck, think back to the theory that you so diligently studied before you began, and this can provide insight into how to write the discussion. This is where your compelling story comes full circle. A proposal is one of the first steps to beginning your own research. In writing one, you will demonstrate that you have a clear idea of where you're going and how to get there. A proposal is also an opportunity to get feedback from an expert about your plan so you can improve it before beginning. In the proposal, as Sill and Roberts suggests, state your objectives, which consist of where you're going and what you hope to achieve. It's also important to demonstrate your knowledge of past related work, which you'll see is often included as introductory information in all types of scientific writing. In this case, it may come as a background or literature review section, depending on your instructor's requirements. Or it could simply be part of the introduction. Either way, show your understanding of the past work and of your work's place within the field. If you're not sure where to start, you can ask your instructor for input while you're working on the proposal. When reviewing your proposal, they may also give you suggested sources to review that could inspire tweaks before you start your research. Though your methods may also change with input from your instructor, in the proposal, lay out your plan for how to conduct the research. Mention relevant materials and techniques, and describe each stage. You can consider using subheadings for each stage. Write what you will do, since you'll do it in the future. Finally, if required, or if you find it helpful to keep you on track, include the time frame for each stage of your proposed study. Sill and Roberts provides these sample sentence starters that show how to use future tense along with transitions of time to lay out your plan in the proposal. The initial stage of this study will be made up of, this will be followed by, if it is found that, the next stage will consist of. A literature review, where you search for and read peer-reviewed articles on your topic, can be a standalone assignment with its own methods, results, and discussion, or it can be part of another paper where it gives the background information to your proposed research. As you're searching for the relevant literature, keep track of databases, search terms, and so on, as when you write up your methods, you must record the steps you followed to conduct your search. In the webinar called Keeping Organized as You Search that I mentioned earlier, the librarians show how to create a search journal for this purpose. The results you report are your findings from reviewing the literature. When taking all those articles into account alongside one another, what did you find? It is your job to report what the literature says when you write your results section. Watch our webinar on this topic or take our mini course to give you more insight into this type of writing. The links will be below. An abstract, like a literature review, can be standalone or part of a paper. Sometimes an abstract can be a type of standalone proposal, for example, when proposing a paper to present at a conference. In that case, you may not have written the paper yet. And in that case, the abstract is kind of like a very short and simplified proposal. Even when the abstract is part of a longer paper, it's still short and simplified because it's a summary of the paper. Therefore, in most cases, don't begin by writing the abstract even though it appears at the beginning of the paper. It appears there so the audience can read an overview and determine whether the paper is relevant to their research. In most cases, you should write your abstract after writing your paper. However, some writers like to draft an abstract as a way to get their writing started. This is a totally valid strategy. Just make sure to return to your abstract and rewrite it after you write your paper. Because the abstract is a summary, you should be sure to include your findings and their significance, though very briefly. What were your results and the main points of your discussion? Although the abstract comes at the beginning of the paper, it is still important to include these conclusions. To help you organize your abstract, you may use headings corresponding to sections of your paper. Even if you delete the headings afterwards, this can help you ensure you've included all important information, including results and discussion. You may also be required to include keywords, for example, when submitting to a journal. The keywords make your paper searchable. You can learn more about writing an abstract in our mini course. The link is below. The paper structure we'll focus on in this webinar is the classic approach for a journal article, so I won't say too much here. However, Sill and Roberts gives good tips for determining your target journal when writing a journal article and looking to publish it. Choose the journal by familiarizing yourself with journals in the field and reading articles in them. This will help you decide where your work fits best. You can also get guidance from your professor or supervisor about an appropriate journal. A strategy I learned from a colleague is to start with the journal with the highest impact or prestige, and if your work is not accepted, you can move to the next highest. To kickstart the writing process, you may want to focus on illustrations and methods to start envisioning your paper if you think more visually or practically. You may find the methods section easiest to write because it's an account of what you did. Swales and Feek advise that you, quote, need to establish that your research questions are sufficiently interesting for publication, unquote. What makes your research unique? Where does it fit in the landscape of other research in the field? Swales and Feek call this positioning. Glassman-Deal calls it research mapping. This doesn't mean your research must be completely unique. It will usually build on or answer to existing research. But it should bring something new to the field, address a gap. Finally, note that you may have to pay a fee to make your article open access, so when applying for funding, consider including this as a line item. You may wish to read Sill and Roberts Chapter 6 on this topic for practical advice for submitting and publishing your paper. For tips on giving presentations, check out our mini course on presenting your work at a conference. Much of the information will also be relevant to other presentations, like a class presentation. Now let's look at the components of a typical paper. If you research science writing, you may find this acronym or a version of it. TIME-RAD is Sill and Roberts' version. Depending on the type of paper, you may not use all of these: title, abstract, introduction, methods, results, and discussion. In many cases for student writing, an abstract will not be required, although it will be for longer pieces like a thesis, and it is required for a journal article or conference submission. Also, depending on the type of paper, the sections may comprise different content. For example, the results section of a literature review paper usually comprises the literature review itself, because that is where the results of the review are given. The discussion can also often encompass the conclusion. You may find that this skeleton is not sufficient for your paper. For example, you may need to include sufficient background information that a background section separate from the introduction is necessary. We'll discuss these variations more later, but for now, TIME-RAD can give you a simple way to remember the required components of your basic paper. To determine which sections you will need for a paper, you can use this link provided below, or you can search Sill and Roberts' ebook called Writing for Science and Engineering, Papers, Presentations, and Reports. Find it on the library website for access to this helpful spreadsheet and many more resources. Similarly to TIME-RAD, you may see versions of this hourglass shape to guide your writing. After the title and abstract, Turbeck et al. Begin this figure with introduction, followed by materials and methods, results, and discussion, then end on conclusions and implications. The wider portions of the hourglass indicate where your writing should be more general, while the narrow portions indicate your writing getting more specific. As we zoom in on the hourglass, we'll just do a quick overview since we will go into much more detail later. As you write your introduction, start general and gradually present more specific information. As you provide background information, start wider than your specific topic. Then start introducing more and more specific information to lead you to your specific topic. This could represent the structure of your introduction, or it could represent an introduction plus a literature review, where the literature review provides more specific and comprehensive information than the introduction did prior to going into the rest of your study. Next, identify a gap, problem, or limitation for study. Depending on the length of your paper, this may still be in the introduction, but the level of specificity is now your paper itself rather than background or context. Or, the gap may be identified through conducting a literature review, and you may discuss the gap in more detail after the review than you did in your introduction. As you can see, there's not only one right way to write your paper, but there's flexibility depending on the needs of the specific paper or research study. In the methods section, now you are talking even more specifically about the details of your research, the actions you took to address the gap you just identified. Now we're at the bottom of the action arrow as we approach the end of the experiment or study and begin to report the results. The results are what findings your actions revealed. Finally, the discussion is all about demonstrating the implications of the results, including how you filled the identified gap. Now let's look at each section more closely. We'll begin with the introduction, where you set the stage for your story. We'll go through the introduction sentence by sentence and give you examples from Simard's Mycorrhizal Networks Facilitate Tree Communication, Learning, and Memory. Much of the following information comes from Glassman-Deal's Science Research Writing for Non-Native Speakers of English, which is an excellent book that I highly recommend, whether your first language is English or another language. You can access the ebook through the library. You can also find the link below. Overall, an introduction is used to establish the purpose and rationale of the paper. In line with the idea of telling a story, Swales and Feek declare that it's your opportunity to grab the reader's attention and attract their interest. In a way, you're showing why the topic is interesting and important to read about. Glassman-Deal provides 10 tasks to help you do this. Establish the topic's significance. Second, give background information. Then give specific evidence. Identify an area for further research. Next, transition to a literature review. Summarize the key research. Identify a gap. Describe the paper. Briefly describe your methodology. And announce your results. These are not strict guidelines to follow. They can simply give you an idea of how to approach it. Simard's introduction, which I will use as an example, is much longer than just the 10 sentences I will present, though it generally follows this basic outline. Similarly, you might write one sentence for each item, or you might write several, depending on the length of the paper and how much background is needed to provide sufficient context for the problem or gap. A rule of thumb is that an introduction is approximately 10 to 15% of a paper. Simard's introduction is about 1,200 out of 6,900, which is about 17%. So there is no hard and fast rule, but you can usually aim for 10 to 15. Finally, note that you may want to write your introduction last, or at least after the methods and results sections. It will make it easier to describe methods and results when you have already written those sections. As you establish the topic's significance, remember we're starting general, so we're not discussing your exact research question yet, but the topic more generally. Some tips. Be confident, not shy, about the importance of your topic of research. This is your chance to convey the importance with your audience. Use present perfect tense at this stage to show what was found in the past but is still true in the present. So, use it to describe past research. Present perfect tense uses have as an auxiliary verb, as in research has been conducted or researchers have found. You may also use simple present tense with is or are to show something that is true in the present. So use it when presenting facts or true statements. Here's an example. Today, plants are commonly recognized as microbiomes, where villages of collaborative microbes live in and on their roots, stems, and leaves, forming interaction networks. In Simard's first sentence, the fact that plants are microbiomes with interaction networks establishes their importance. For more on English verb tenses, you can visit this link given below. Here are some words that may be useful when establishing significance. Adverbs that describe adjectives or actions or establish time, like frequently. Adjectives that show how much, like many. Adjective-noun pairs that describe the magnitude of the problem, like fundamental issue or dramatic increase. These are not the only words that can be used, and they don't have to be used in the order presented, like with the adjective-noun pairs. These are only suggestions for a starting place. That goes for all the vocabulary we'll cover today. You can consult Glassman Deal's book, Science Research Writing for Non-Native Speakers of English, for longer vocabulary lists and much more insight. Putting some of the significance vocabulary to use, here are some sample sentence starters. Today, it is well known that a central problem in the field is this challenging area has attracted attention because traditionally, the common approach was many researchers have now found that. To give background information, provide factual information that introduces the topic. Start with whatever fact is most general, thinking of the hourglass shape. This gives the reader enough information to understand the problem when you introduce it later. Again, use present tense to present factual statements because they are true in the present. In this example, Simard gives more information about the microbial networks so the audience understands what they are and what they do. These microbial networks of fungi, bacteria, archaea, viruses, protists, and algae, as well as nematodes, arthropods, and protozoa, work together with the plants in complex adaptive systems to drive nature's biogeochemical cycles and influence every aspect of ecosystem structure and function. Next, give evidence that is more specific than the previous facts to support those general facts and the statement of significance. Select sources from your research that provide background information or key findings on the topic. Summarize their findings and cite the sources. Again, you can use present perfect have to describe studies that were done in the past, if their findings are still true in the present. As in, studies have shown that. Let's take a look at an example. The interaction among microbiomes and plants is so fundamental to life on Earth that it is credited with the chemical weathering of rock and migration of ancient plants from the ocean to land about 360 million years ago, and the subsequent coevolution of highly specialized gymnosperm and angiosperm trees, and ultimately humans. Here, Simard gives a specific example of the complexity and importance of plants as microbiomes. She presents the sentence as a fact rather than as findings of specific studies, so she uses present tense. She cites 3 sources, 2 of them recent to her publication date. Ideally, cite sources that are critical to the field. Maybe they contributed to initial research that established the topic of interest, so they may sometimes be older. Or maybe they have conducted more recent research and made significant findings. Here are some vocabulary you can use to introduce background. Noun-verb pairs include results have indicated and the authors examined. These vocab are also applicable to literature reviews. Here are more background sentence starters. Simard examined. Others have found that. Studies have confirmed that. The authors interpreted the data to mean. They focused on. Findings suggested. The researchers recommended. Next, identify a general gap, problem, or area of research identified by current researchers as in need of further study. This area is more specific than the general thoughts you begin with, but still think the hourglass. This is a general area that provides the context for your paper, not yet the specific problem your paper deals with. That will come a little later. Looking at the example, we can notice the difference. Plants, including trees, are increasingly understood to have cognitive capacity for perceiving, processing, and communicating with other plants, organisms, and the environment, and to remember and use this information to learn, adjust their behaviors, and adapt accordingly. So, sentence number 1 identified plants as microbiomes, while this sentence identifies plants and trees' cognitive capacity. The first established the general topic, while this one identifies a subtopic of that general topic. The area for further research may or may not require a reference. As Glassman-Deal explains, if it is a well-known problem, then it is not necessary to provide a reference in every case. The background information you discuss next will help you transition to the more specific evidence of a literature review. Again, we're getting more specific than the earlier evidence provided. For example, trees are known to perceive and communicate with each other and other plants through root pathways, or using airborne signals. They can also recognize the identity of neighboring plants and whether they are genetically related through root exudates or mycorrhizas. Here, Simard summarizes the main concepts known about how trees communicate. In contrast, the earlier evidence was on the general idea of the microbial network's role in working with the plants. This one is about the specific ways trees communicate, including how they communicate through mycorrhizas. So, we are gradually getting more specific, like the hourglass. As you summarize key research, focus on whatever is most important to your specific research question. In the example, Simard gives the most specific research that informs her paper, Belushka and Mancuso's proposal. Belushka and Mancuso propose that within and between plant communication is accomplished primarily via signal transport within and between roots, where compounds such as auxins serve as neurotransmitters across synapses at cell crosswalls within roots, across synapses between the apices of different plant roots, or between plant roots and symbiotic microbes and fungi in the rhizosphere. Notice the similarity and difference to the third sentence about the origins of the relationship between plants and their microbiomes, which provided evidence related to sentences number 1 and 2. This one is much more specific, even touching on the compounds and bodies involved in plant communication. You may be feeling unsure whether you can actually notice a gap or problem in previous research, but be confident that you can. You are a participant in this field of study, and your contributions are welcome. Glassman-Deal also notes that you need not fear that you are being overly critical because the language you use will be respectful and impersonal. Furthermore, this is an expected part of conducting a study or writing a paper, and other authors even identify their own limitations, giving you a possible way into your research. You can use a contrast transition to acknowledge what previous studies have found or highlight what is still unknown. For example, although research has shown, or however, few studies have. In this example, notice the contrast transition yet, which recognizes the previous findings, but signals that a gap in those findings is about to be stated. Yet, much of the historic research on plant communication and cognition has been conducted on non-mycorrhizal plants grown in the lab, or has not reported on the role of mycorrhizal fungi. I've included here a list of contrast transitions and other vocabulary you can use when identifying the gap. For example, A potential flaw is that, nevertheless, research has been confined to, even though blank, a drawback is, still, blank is not yet well understood. However, the absence of blank means, now we're arriving at your specific study and paper. Finally, a prediction or hypothesis may appear in or around your identification of a gap, or in your purpose statement, which is a description of what the paper will do. Use simple present tense, as you'll see Simard does with I propose and this chapter aims to, because the paper exists in the present. You could also use simple past to describe the aim, as in the aim of the study was, because you had an aim that you then accomplished. If the study is still in progress, such as with a literature review that will precede the research you will conduct, then use simple present, the aim of this work is to, because the aim has only been partially accomplished. Here is Simard's proposal. I propose that most below-ground communication between trees and nature is mediated by mycorrhizas, and that mycorrhizal networks are intimately involved in tree cognition. Next, she gives her purpose statement. Therefore, this chapter aims to review the fundamental role of mycorrhizal fungal networks in communication between trees, and the functional, ecological, and evolutionary significance of this communication to forest communities in nature. Next, just give an overview of the methodology so the reader understands the basic methods used. For example, if you're writing a literature review, state that the paper reviews the literature. You may find that you end up combining your purpose statement with the overview of methodology if they both cover the same point, and that's okay. Just be sure to avoid giving too much detail, as doing so could negate the actual methods section. Sticking to the rule of thumb I gave of 10 to 15% for the introduction can help you prevent this. Here, Simard says that in a single sentence what her method is, to review the experimental evidence she has gathered from her work. I will review existing experimental evidence for cognition among trees facilitated by mycorrhizas, showcasing examples from the research in my lab. Finally, the last step for your introduction is to announce the results. For the same reason as on the previous slide, do not give too much detail. Give enough so the reader understands the main finding. This is like the thesis statement of a non-scientific paper, the main idea that the paper aims to support throughout, leading to the conclusion where the main idea is re-emphasized. In the same way, the components of a scientific paper support and lead to the main findings. They show how you arrived at those findings. For example, it is my hope that this might lead to an integrated approach to studying plant cognition in natural ecosystems that includes plant microbiomes. Simard's paper is an overview of her findings of her ongoing studies of plant cognition in natural ecosystems. So here she expresses her intended result, which is to lead other researchers to take an integrated approach that includes plant microbiomes. This is what she wants readers to get out of reading the paper. For your paper, the main thing you may want readers to get out of reading is an understanding of your findings, so you would state your main finding. Here's an overview of the formula for an introduction with a simpler way to think of it. Notice how it moves from a general idea supported by evidence in diagram number 1 to a more specific idea supported by evidence and a specific gap in diagram number 2. You begin with a background factual information on the general topic, then give similar background findings on the more specific topic, and finally identify the very specific gap in the research. Diagram number 3 shows that you end your introduction by providing details of how your paper addresses the gap. Next up, the methodology presents the events of your story to show the process of how you added to the landscape of the field. Glassman-Deal breaks down several important tasks that you may do in your methodology section. 1. Give background or overview. 2. Relate to other studies. 3. Identify materials. 4. Give precise details of methods. Next, justify your choices. Indicate that care was taken. And indicate where problems occurred. Again, these are not strict guidelines to follow precisely. Some of these items can come in a different order, as we'll see, and you may not need all of them, depending on your particular situation. For an article on an experiment or study, be sure to include most items. For a lab report, where this section may be called Experiment or Procedures, you will likely be more concise, as Perways and Anwar note that the lab manual is the right place for precise step-by-step details. You don't usually need to copy and paste them into your report. Note that methodology for a literature review would detail the methods you used to find the articles you reviewed, including databases, keywords, and so on. To illustrate each of these steps, we'll use an example in astronomy from Liu et al. And one in computer science from Li et al. Neither of these papers includes all of the items, so they also demonstrate that you may not need to include everything from 1 to 8. Begin by giving the background to or an overview of the methodology. Remember the hourglass shape. The background is intended to ease the reader into the section, so it provides a general statement rather than diving right into details. As you write the method section, you will gradually get more specific, moving towards specific details about your work. To give an overview, you could make general statements about parameters, such as number of tests, or basic information about the materials used. Another option is to review the study's aim as a reminder for the reader, which is useful in a journal article where a reader who wants to evaluate the methods or repeat the experiment may skim the introduction or not have read it for a while. However, this may not be necessary when the work is very narrow and the audience is researchers doing similar work. The example from Li et al. Revisits the aim of the work. Our primary methodology or focus is to enable LLMs to follow a structured expert workflow designed using domain knowledge in such an agentic manner. This example from Liu et al. Demonstrates that the methods section can dive right into the details, but this works best when the audience is very specialized. In our analysis, we use a compilation of the Cosmos optical near-infrared data, which includes observations with the HST ACS, the Subaru telescope, the Canada-France-Hawaii telescope, and the 4M KPNO, Mayall, and CTIO Blanco telescopes, as well as supplementary data from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. Relating to other studies can occur at any relevant spot in the section. It may appear near the beginning as a way of establishing the context for your methods. For example, if your methodology substantially builds on someone else's work. Other choices may have been influenced by others' work, such as an example that Glassman-Deal gives of choosing a study location based on previous researchers' validation of that spot. So you should cite other studies for any material, procedure, or technique that was borrowed from, influenced by, or validated by other researchers. This not only provides credit where it is due and prevents plagiarism, but it can also help to justify your choices. Here, Liu et al. Give credit to Mobasher et al. For a portion of their methods. Photometric redshifts for individual galaxies were computed using the methods described in Mobasher et al. Li et al. Did not relate to other studies in their methods section, and it may not be necessary to do so if you provided sufficient background in the introduction and your methods aren't derived from others' work. While relating to others' work can happen at any relevant point in the section, identifying materials and their source should come near the beginning, as the materials need to be laid out and understood before detailing the procedures. Materials could include chemicals, equipment, tools, and so on. Materials can be many different things depending on the field you're in. Even in Li et al.'s work on LLMs, they give a list of the digital tools they used, including phrase tool, language tool, and common sense tool, which we'll see. Whether your materials are physical or virtual, you may need to describe their properties using present tense, such as this material is able to The source of the materials, using simple past, shows where the materials came from so other researchers can reproduce the experiment. For example, this material was obtained from. Source may not be necessary, for example, if you constructed your own materials. However, then you are arguably the source yourself, so stating that you constructed your own materials would be the detail to include. Here, Lee et al. Have described the properties of the tool they categorize as phrase tool. This tool is tailored to scrutinize news claims by examining the presence of sensational teasers, provocative or emotionally charged language, or exaggerated claims. It operates under the assumption that fake news often employs these tactics to attract attention from readers. When detailing the methods, give as much detail as you can. Details that seem obvious to you could make a difference if the audience is trying to understand exactly what you did. You will want your methods to be reproducible, so sufficient detail is needed so any other researcher could follow your exact procedures. This is why Glassman-Diel suggests erring on the side of too much detail for methodology rather than risking too little. Details might include quantity, temperatures, duration, sequence, conditions, locations, and size. You can see in Lee et al.'s methods that they identify details such as frameworks and models used, parameter settings, and the details they use to represent each article. We employ the Lang chain framework and GPT 3.5 turbo model as the underlying LLM for all tools employed in the analysis engine. The temperature parameter is set to 0 to ensure the reproducibility. Each article is represented using its title, domain URL, and publication date for PolitiFact and GossipCop dataset. Note that usually this portion will be in simple past tense, as in we employed, because you have already conducted the experiment. However, a proposal would be future tense, as in we will employ, because you are proposing the methodology and have not completed it yet. Here, Lee et al. Use present tense, we employ, because presumably their experiment is ongoing. Be sure to justify your choice in methods to demonstrate the validity of your experiment. In the example, you can see in the phrasing to ensure that Lee et al. Are explaining why they took a certain action, why it was important. This can help the audience to accept the methodology. A perceived flaw or gap in the methodology could lead the reader to dismiss the results or validity of the study. Lee et al. Say, to ensure an equitable comparison of LLMs using individually designed tools and fact agent following the designed expert workflow, we retain the analysis results at each step from each tool throughout the workflow process, and then apply the same bullet point for each tool in Figure 1 methodology to derive the final prediction veracity results for LLM using each tool in a zero-shot manner. Like with justifying choices, demonstrating that appropriate care was taken supports the validity of the methods and can gain the audience's acceptance. As Glassman-Diel puts it, it is important to present yourself as a competent researcher who carries out procedures accurately and with care. So you might use adverbs such as these: carefully, fully, suitably, or thoroughly. In the example, Liu et al. Point to the importance of taking great care in this sentence, which then transitions into sentences that illustrate the care they therefore took. As with all surveys that rely primarily on photometric rather than spectroscopic redshifts, the application of the Cosmos galaxy sample to the derivation of galaxy LFs requires great care in order to account for both random and systematic errors in the redshift determinations. It is also important to acknowledge methodological problems in this section rather than waiting to describe limitations in the discussion or conclusion. If the reader only reads the methods section, they should be aware of everything relevant to the methods section. If the audience wanted to reproduce the methods, identifying possible errors can help them to avoid those in future. You also want to demonstrate your own awareness as a researcher. Avoiding mentioning imperfections can make you appear less competent. By acknowledging any problems, you further establish your legitimacy as a researcher. It can also give you an opportunity to explain how you dealt with them and how the problems did not affect the results, assuming they didn't. Here, Liu et al. Identified potential problems that could arise from their methods and how they corrected for them. There is the risk that more light would be added into lower redshift bins than would be removed from them. This could bias the distribution of derived absolute magnitudes in those bins. We quantify and correct for these errors using Monte Carlo simulations in the manner described by Liu et al. 1998. This slide can help you form sentences by following the items in order, like, all of the samples were collected. You can find the slides linked to below. Here, note that some adjectives can become verbs and vice versa. For example, aligned describes something, while align is the action you do to make it aligned. To create an adjective from the verb, make the verb into its past participle. For regular verbs, this means adding ed to the end of the word, align to aligned. Glassman-Deal also advises using justifying phrases such as because to show why you selected certain actions in your methods. Here are more sentence starters or templates for you to follow using this vocabulary. All of the samples were collected upstream of the waste facility so that the two instruments were stabilized by placing them. The majority of the trials were carried out on the basis of. Your results are one of the most exciting parts of your story that you've gradually built up to by introducing your study and presenting the methods. The audience is on the edge of their seats. What did you find? Glassman-Deal gives several tasks for the results section and goes into each in more detail. I've included some of the most relevant here. 1. Give background or overview. 2. Give specific or key results. 3. Relate to other studies. 4. Indicate where problems occurred. And 5. Identify possible implications. You'll notice that there is some interpretation in this section, which you may find surprising if you expected results to be just a straightforward reporting of data. Thompson, as cited in Swales and Feek, found that 19 out of 20 science writers in biochemistry included justification of methodology and interpretation in the results. Furthermore, about half cited agreement with previous studies and commented on the data. Thus, there may seem to be some overlap between results and discussion, but we'll see through the examples how these two sections differ. This time, begin by giving the background to or an overview of the results. Because of the hourglass approach, which moves from general to specific to guide the reader to understand the details, start general as you do in every section. The beginning of the results section can make general statements to ease the reader in and/or potentially refer to a previous section, such as through expanding on or reminding the reader of methods. Once again, revisiting the aim can also be a way to start generally. From Lee et al., our observations reveal that FactAgent, following the expert workflow, achieves superior performance compared to other baselines on all datasets. It is a good idea to transition into specific or key results by inviting the reader to review the data, especially if it is presented in a chart or table. For example, Lee et al. Point the reader to the table by saying the performance comparisons of different models are summarized in Table 2. Anytime a table, chart, or other figure is included, provide this kind of call-out, which means referring to it in the text at the relevant time that the reader should review it. As mentioned for the results section of a lab report, choose the ideal medium, such as table, graph, or chart, to present the data in a clear and comprehensible way. Also be aware of the order in which you present the data. Though you may be tempted to present most significant findings first, Glassman-Deal suggests that it's more important to build up to those findings by presenting the results that underlie them. Again, think of it like a story. Glassman-Deal states also that results do not speak for themselves. Though some results may be straightforward enough to present objectively with little comment, interpretation through evaluative language can guide the reader to understand your findings. While you don't want to evaluate in a biased way, you can use evaluative comments to draw the reader's attention to certain details. Here are two examples of what such comments might look like. Phrases like "as can be seen in Figure 1" and "as detailed in Figure 2" comprise an invitation to view the data, and then the data presented in the figure is interpreted or evaluated in the sentence. And here's an example. FactAgent enables LLMs to search for related news claims online and detect conflicting reports, leveraging external sources to enhance their veracity assessment. Additionally, FactAgent allows LLMs to check the credibility of domain URLs using both internal knowledge of domain URLs and external databases containing recent domain URLs associated with verified fake news. In the example, Lee et al. Have identified specific things they learned or verified about FactAgent through performing their study. Their comments could be considered evaluative because they are interpreting the meaning of their findings, such as how the LLMs leverage external sources to enhance their veracity assessment. As you earlier placed your research in the context of other research, here you can get more narrow or specific on the hourglass shape and specifically compare your findings to findings from other research. Swales and Feek's positioning, or Glassman-Diel's research mapping that we discussed earlier. Where do your results lie when comparing them to the field of research in this area? Based on some of Glassman-Diel's examples, here are some samples of how you might word your comparisons. This finding was consistent with "a striking difference occurred." The sentence we saw in item number 1, which was the first sentence in Lee et al.'s results section, not only provides an overview of their results, but also provided an initial comparison to results from earlier datasets. In this example, Lee et al. Compare specific findings to findings from others' work, which also builds their validity because similar tests yielded similar results. They say, comparing the performances of LLMs using different prompting techniques, that is, standard prompt, COT prompt, or making decisions based on findings from each designed tool, we observe that LLMs utilizing COT prompting do not consistently outperform standard prompting techniques. This observation is consistent with previous research, which also highlighted similar conclusions. Notice that the specific study or studies should be cited as they are in the footnote 22 in the example. Plus, where an important difference is shown between your results and past results, this could demonstrate the novelty of your research and the significance of your finding. Like with the methodology, Glassman-Diel reminds us that it is critical to acknowledge any issues that arise within the results, such as if they are incomplete or somehow don't fit. If it's possible and doesn't involve the twisting of the truth, you can use minimizing language to show the lesser importance of the problem, such as "nevertheless." It is important to provide a reason or suggest a solution to indicate your competence as a researcher. This will further minimize the significance of the problem and show that it is either normal or can be addressed appropriately. For example, "this was unavoidable because," or "future work will address this in such a way." Lee et al. Used the minimizing word "despite" to begin their sentence identifying a problem. Then they contrast it with the action they took in response. The example also shows the solution Lee et al. Used to address their problem. Despite the suboptimal performance of relying solely on external searches, this subsection evaluates the impact of incorporating the external search tool within the expert workflow for FactAgent. To test the importance of the search tool, we exclude it from the expert workflow, leaving the LLM to assess veracity based solely on the available tools, which primarily utilize the LLM's internal knowledge. Though implications are typically the focus of the discussion section, it is valid and useful to end the results section with a comment on significance. Implications could also include applications, such as in the example where Lee et al. Show how their finding can be applied to the structuring of workflows. Such sentences provide a concluding feel to the section by summing up the main point or points that the reader should get from having reviewed the results. You can use wording like "suggest" and "indicate" to initiate an identification of possible implications. Lee et al. Use underscore. These observations underscore the importance of structuring an expert workflow that incorporates domain knowledge to design appropriate tools specific to the dataset's domain, rather than allowing the LLM to automatically design its own workflow for FactAgent. Vocabulary for results can be split into objective and subjective word choices. Notice what makes these words objective. They describe objective truths. In a way, they answer yes or no questions. Did it accelerate? Yes or no? Did it change? Yes or no? It either changed or it didn't, so change is an objective verb. In the adjectives, notice that high is not objective, it's subjective. However, higher and highest present objective truths when comparing two things. Either one number is higher than the other, or not, and only one is the highest. Numerical values are also objective. Like we saw before, the verbs can be changed into adjectives by adding ed for regular verbs. For example, accelerate to accelerated, change to changed, and vary to varied. Here are some objective sentence starters for you. Blank accelerated at a higher rate than blank. The results varied. Identical declines were seen. According to Glassman-Deal, subjective language is actually more commonly used to describe results than objective language. She contends that this is because an objective description of the results does not tell readers anything they don't already know from looking at the data. Subjective language can add the evaluation or interpretation element to the results section. Just be sure to choose the word that best describes what happened. Do not underplay or exaggerate it. Remember that adjectives can often be turned into adverbs by adding ly, and vice versa. You can see in this way that some of the adjectives make good introductory phrases or transition words to begin a sentence with. For example, interestingly, significantly, unexpectedly. As I mentioned on the previous slide, high and low are subjective, so they're on the adjective list here. This vocabulary is mainly for presenting results and perhaps commenting on them. See Glassman-Deal's book for much more specific vocabulary for each step of the results section. And here are some subjective sentence starters. The majority of blank increased almost imperceptibly. It appears that almost all results reached a satisfactory level. Unexpectedly, there was a sudden drop in. The rapid growth in blank was noticeably different from that in blank. Significantly, results were only slightly lower than. The discussion is where all the different pieces of the story come together. You fully flesh out the significance of your research and shape the main idea the audience will remember by translating details into implications or concepts. I'll start by giving you an adaptation of Glassman-Deal's formula for the discussion conclusion section. The two are often found together under the single heading of discussion or conclusion or something similar. So first, summarize key points. Next, map the study's contribution. State the contribution clearly. State the contribution's implications. State the contribution's applications. Explain limitations, and suggest future work. What you might notice about this formula is that the focus is on your study's contribution. Remember, the results don't speak for themselves, and the same goes for the results section we just discussed. It also doesn't speak for itself. However, often, because the results section is focused on presenting the findings and interpreting them so their meaning is understandable, it can be quite technical and specific in comparison to the discussion section. Now we're coming back to the wider part of the hourglass. Therefore, as Swales and Feek point out, the discussion section offers an increasingly generalized account of what has been learned in the study. You can think back on what the audience already knows from reading the introduction, methods, and results, and try to fill in your own gaps. What is important that's left for them to know? Most important is likely the significance of your study. the implications and possibilities for future work. Another way to think of it is that the discussion section gives a chance for you to speak your voice and express the contribution that you've made. Glassman-Deal notes that there are many ways to start this section. Remember, you will start in a general manner, so some kind of summary or revisiting of previous information is useful to orient the reader to what's to come. Whatever you feel is most important about your paper so far is ideal to begin the discussion section with. That could be a reminder of the gap, problem, or prediction, the methodology, or the results. Summarizing key results gives a natural transition from the results section to this one, and it also reiterates some of the most important information the audience needs to know to understand the rest of the discussion. In most cases, this is probably the most likely way to start, even though it can be correct to start in other ways as well. Liu et al. Begin a subsection of their discussion this way. They recap one of their major findings, which the subsection provides more detail about. The luminosity functions in the 4 galaxy spectral type bins we used, SED templates of early type, SBC, SCD plus IRR, and low extinction starbursts, follow the well-known pattern of steeper values for alpha for bluer galaxies. In the introduction, you gave an overview of related studies. In the methods section, you compared methods to those of existing studies, and in the results section, you compared specific findings to those from other studies. Now, expand on the place your overall findings fit within the field. You may need to flesh out earlier comparisons in more detail, or make a general statement that sums up where the study's contribution fits. As Glassman-Deal notes, this is different and still more specific than actually stating the contribution itself, which we'll see is the next step. For example, Liu et al. Make a statement about where one of their categories of findings fits, which is in a spot consistent with previous authors. They say, as with the full galaxy sample, these type-specific results are consistent with the findings of previous work in the literature. Of course, due to differing galaxy selection criteria and redshift binning, exact comparisons are not always possible. Generally speaking, however, for local galaxies, our red/early type and intermediate spiral galaxy LFs are consistent with. Did you notice that their comparison is general, not exact? They go on to cite the specific studies this category is comparable to and how. Now that you've stated where the contribution your study makes fits, be sure to explicitly state the contribution itself. You can see that in the example that Liu et al. Used subjective language such as striking to emphasize their positive contribution. In the context of the broad consistency of our results with those in the literature, perhaps the most striking result in this work is the clear trend with every galaxy spectral type of a flattening of the faint end slope with increasing redshift. The implications are what the positive achievement your study makes implies. Verbs like suggests and indicates are ones you can use to state the implications. Glassman-Deal also advises to suggest why results occurred as they did and offer an explanation behind the mechanisms of your findings and observations. This is another aspect that makes the discussion a deeper examination than the results section allowed. Now you are commenting on the results and their meaning, including why they may have emerged. The example we'll see shows this exploration with the wording of due to the substantial depth. Due to the substantial depth of the Cosmos survey imaging, it is likely that we have successfully measured a larger fraction of low surface brightness dwarf galaxies that have wider area, shallower surveys such as SDSS or 2D FGRs. The steepness of our low redshift LFs may reflect this. Here, Liu et al. Explain the implications through the wording, it is likely. The findings suggest, though perhaps do not prove, so the careful language is used, that their methods were successful in measuring a larger fraction of the galaxies than previous methods. There is also a bit of comparison here, so the mapping of the contribution continues. The order of most of these items can be fluid. The implications of your contribution may include direct applications, though not always. If you're not sure about a practical application, you can revisit your introduction for hints, as that is where you laid out the gaps in the field. Further reading can also be useful. Glassman-Diel suggests to review discussion sections of the relevant literature to get these more specific ideas of how your contribution could be applied. Here's an example from Lee et al. These benefits have significant implications, such as using FactAgent with a carefully designed workflow to assist humans in data annotation for training supervised models for fake news detection. Here, they identify implications in this sentence, but you can see that the implication is a practical application in which FactAgent can be used. You will have already mentioned some limitations as they arose in the methodology and the results. Now, give overall comments on problems or limitations, as once again this is important to show your competence and reliability. Glassman-Diel hints that you should take a view of the limitations in a way that allows you to lead into future directions, which will be our next item. Here is an example of Liu et al. Identifying a limitation in their discussion. Even the Cosmos survey depth, however, does not allow us to measure values of alpha fainter than MV approximately -17 at Z equals 0.5. So we cannot say if the flattening of alpha in our higher redshift bins is due to the non-detection of these dwarfs. Similar to mapping, suggesting future work that builds on yours shows how the field can grow as a result of your contribution. If you plan to build on it yourself, invite the audience to follow your work. However, if the suggested direction is not work you plan to conduct, your statement can still offer an explicit path for other researchers to follow. As Glassman-Diel puts it, a study which responds to the difficulties or limitations of your work may provide you with useful data for your own current and future work, so you may wish to invite others to continue in various directions. Here is our example. When the spectroscopic portion of the Cosmos survey is completed, we will be able to address this question in more detail as we deconvolve the faint end of the galaxy LF as a multivariate function of color, morphology, luminosity, and redshift. After providing more detail about the limitations, Liu et al. State their plan for continued work and how it will address the problem. Stating your next steps gives the audience a next installment to watch for. The verbs for mapping here from Glassman-Diel give you action words for placing your work in the context of other research. The adjectives can be used to describe your contribution in a positive light. You can also borrow from the phrases of limitation or future work to invite the audience to move in a certain direction with the research. Here are some examples of how you might begin such sentences. Our results confirm previous findings that I have demonstrated a more effective method of. This provides insight into the question of we have produced and improved. Even the references relate to the story of your research, as they provide the context of which your research is a part. The authors are writers with similar but different stories that have influenced your work, and citations and references ensure they receive proper credit. Let's start with avoiding plagiarism. Where does plagiarism end and writing original work begin? An exercise adapted from Swales and Feek demonstrates. We'll go through different ways you might approach borrowing information from a source and talk about which ones are appropriate. First, do not copy word for word from any source. As mentioned earlier, quoting is very rare in scientific writing, so there is infrequently any need to copy word for word, even when providing a citation. Without quoting in quotation marks or block quotation format along with citing, this is still plagiarism because it makes the words appear that you paraphrased them. Swapping out synonyms and making other minor changes is not a good strategy either. If you watch our effective paraphrasing webinar mentioned earlier, you'll see examples of why this is still plagiarism, even with a citation. You're giving credit to the author for the idea, but again it appears as though you're passing off their words for your own. The same goes for rearranging sentences or sentence structure. When you merely do this, it is still plagiarism, even with a citation. Whereas little changes don't work, substantially rewriting and paraphrasing in your own words does. Just also be sure to cite your source. Therefore, only the last of these constitutes original work. The rest constitute plagiarism. Remember that we're here to help at the right site if you're struggling with effectively putting ideas into your own words. And we suggest beginning by watching our effective paraphrasing webinar. Helen Roberts also notes that each figure borrowed from another source must be cited. This is another good reason to not simply copy material out of your lab manual. Here is an example adapted from Mac that shows how to properly cite a figure in APA citation. The note under the figure provides the citation, which includes more detail than a typical citation, but a corresponding reference is still required on the references page. Note that APA also requires a copyright notice where applicable. You can look for the copyright information on the page where the article lives on the journal website. If used for a school assignment, your use will likely fall under fair dealing guidelines. However, you will need to request permission to use the figure if you will be publishing your paper. And either way, you will need to include this copyright notice. Now, the figure is cited with a CSE footnote citation. This method also requires a corresponding reference on the references page. You can use this fair dealing decision tool for educators, linked to below, to help you decide whether permission is needed to use a source, depending on the copyright status and the purpose of the use. Sometimes you might be tempted to cite a source you read about in an article. For example, if you read background information with a bunch of footnotes indicating the information shared is coming from other sources, you should not cite the article you're reading, known as a secondary source. You need to go to the original or primary source. It is too easy to misrepresent the original author by citing them indirectly. As the CSE manual states, if an author feels that the information in a document is important enough to be cited within the text, it is equally important to verify this information by examining the original. So, do your best to track down an original. In some cases, the original may not be available. If this is the case, CSE guidelines state to cite the article you are reading. Don't cite the original, because you cannot verify that they actually said what this article claims. If you're using APA, there are other guidelines to follow that you can read about in our blog post on citing a source within a source. However, you should still avoid citing sources within sources whenever possible. See the link below. Here we have useful links for each style guide, APA, CSE, and IEEE. For APA, there's a link to examples and formatting information about citations and references, formatting information for tables and figures, and sample papers you can use to follow. You can also borrow the book from the library. For CSE, we have a link to citations and references formatting. And if you've used CSE, you know that journal titles need to be abbreviated in the references. So here is a website that abbreviates for you. Once again, you can borrow the book from the library. For IEEE, we have links to format for citations and references, as well as a journal title abbreviator, the style manual, conference template, and editing mathematics guide. For IEEE, all three guides, references, math, and style, are available in the Author Center, so visit that page for updated links. The links we have below are links to our library guides for APA, CSE, and IEEE, all of which contain all of these links. I'll end with a quick note about reference generators. They can be a great starting place. However, you still need to understand the rules of your style because these generators can regularly make mistakes. Double-check or proofread them, especially for font, capitalization, and excess information. I have used both MyBib and Zotero. MyBib I've only tested, Zotero I have used extensively. Both I still had to proofread. MyBib has all three styles, APA, CSE, and IEEE. Zotero currently seems to be missing CSE. Thank you so much for watching. Please visit the Athabasca University Write site at the link below for more resources or to work with a writing coach.